my mouth and the meditations of our hearts be acceptable to you, O God, O Lord, our rock and our Redeemer. Amen. Sisters and brothers, today we pause and we reflect on Jesus' life as he enters into Jerusalem. Large crowds were gathered with hope that this Jesus who rode into Jerusalem would deliver them from all their problems and offer them all their expectations. Marcus Borg and John Dominic Crossan write about Jerusalem, "It is the city of God and the faithless city, the city of hope and the city of oppression, the city of joy and the city of pain." In many ways, Jesus could not possibly have fulfilled all the expectations of all the people that were in that crowd. Palm Sunday ushers in Holy Week, the last week of Jesus' life, where two kingdoms collide, God and Caesar. We all know where this is going. In his booklet about God, Manna and Mercy, Daniel Erlander, a Lutheran minister, attempts to kind of tell this passion story, the story of what happens in that Holy Week. And he does it, and I'm going to read his text to you this morning, because so often on Palm Sunday we come and we celebrate the wonderful triumphal entry, and we have little snippets of things that happen during the week, but you don't really hear the story. This morning we will. He invites us, in the way that he writes, to think in our contemporary world of how the story of Jesus' life might engage our hearts, our minds, our spirits. It was Sunday when Jesus entered Jerusalem on a donkey, the sign of a king coming in peace. The city was filled with pilgrims who had traveled to the holy city for the feast of Passover. The poor people were ecstatic. Would he make things right? Would he defeat the Romans and their accomplices? Would he establish a kingdom of righteousness and mercy? The big deals among the Jewish people were now severely threatened. They were afraid that Jesus would either succeed in establishing a society based on his ideas, or he would bring the entire nation to ruin. What if the poor and sinners and the unworthy were exalted, and the nice people and the pure people were sent away empty? The big deals held numerous executive board meetings with one agenda item. How can we get rid of him? Yes, how? How? Yes, how can we get rid of him? Yes, how? There was one who was sleeping. How? Erlander calls the hegemony, which is really a big word for leaders or those that are dominant in a society, he calls them the big deals. So when you hear that word, you'll know that it's leadership. In Jerusalem, Jesus wept because the big deals and most of the people were blind. They didn't understand God's way of bringing peace. Tensions mounted when Jesus entered the temple. It was filled with business, with people selling things. They were part of a system which exploited the poor and kept the temple from being a house of prayer for all nations. Jesus protested by driving the sellers out of the temple. The big deals decided it was time to act. By Thursday, they were ready to make their move. On the evening of that Thursday, Jesus shared a special meal with his disciples. The meal portrayed the reign of Christ, where there is abundance, abundant manna for all, bread and wine enough for all, shared by all, abundant mercy for all, Jesus' body and blood, given and shed for all, forgiveness of sin, a vision of a new world of shalom, ushered in by the power of suffering love, the very presence of God in the ordinary, in creation, in bread and in wine. The anticipation of God's future, the complete reign of God, a mystical bonding of Jesus and his friends, a bonding of all who celebrate and participate in the meal of shalom. Community is born in the sharing of the bread and wine, a promise of the continuing presence of Jesus with his disciples in the breaking of the bread. the end of all hierarchy. The leader is servant. The greater is servant of all. A new covenant between God and God's people, a restored wilderness community. All receive, all share, all have enough. No one has too much. Jesus commanded his disciples to do this in memory of me, to share the meal over and over, and thus be incorporated again and again and again into Jesus' life of manna and mercy. This meal was indeed the new covenant, the new bonding between God and God's people. Jesus told his disciples he would not share this meal again until the completion of God's reign. In the meantime, he gave this meal to his disciples as a gift, a foretaste of the feast to come. After supper, Jesus went to his favorite garden to pray. Yahweh and Jesus cried and cried together. In the midst of his prayer, Jesus remembered the words of the tempter, "There is a better way to be Messiah." Jesus thought of ways to establish God's reign, which would make sense to his disciples and to the nation. Jesus thought about all other ways and cried, "No." He fell into dust, his sweat falling to the ground like drops of blood. Jesus decided to follow the way of suffering love, the way taught by the tender prophet of exile. Yahweh continued to weep and sent an angel to comfort Jesus. Then the armies of the big deals came, and they resented one world which could not tolerate the existence of another world. It was necessary to destroy the threat of uncontrolled goodness. Their worldview was that the big deals would control little people, that manna would be hoarded, that God's abundance would be for some, that God's mercy would be for some, that God's blessing and privilege would be for a few, that they would be self-righteous, that there would be good news for the rich and for the powerful, that they would trust in human power, that it was the reign of death. And then there was Jesus' worldview, which was entirely new and different. All were partners with God. All shared manna. God's abundance was for everyone. God's mercy was for all. God's blessing was for all. God's forgiveness was for sinners. God's good news was for the poor and the powerless. You would trust in God's power, and it was the reign of life. The big deal religious leaders and the Roman rulers collaborated to arrest and condemn God's beloved one, who represented the dangerous reign of love and mercy and shalom. They sentenced him to death by crucifixion, and then they stripped him and flogged him and ridiculed him. They forced him to march to the place of crucifixion with Simon of Cyrene carrying the cross behind Jesus. The soldiers of the rulers nailed him to a cross. The wails of God filled the universe. Together, Yahweh, Sabaoth, and Jesus entered the watery depths of chaos. Together, they bore the pain of the world. They absorbed the arrogance, the hatred, the violence of the big deals. In his last moments, Jesus continued his life of mercy and manna for all. He promised the banquet of paradise to an unworthy criminal. He offered mercy to all as he cried out, "Abba, forgive them, for they do not know what they are doing." Certainly, this man was righteousness, committing his spirit into the hands of the suffering God. The bringer of peace died. All creation groaned in travail, waiting for shalom, for the completion of God's reign of God. The Roman soldier in charge of the crucifixion was deeply moved by the willing suffering of this righteous man. He praised God, and he realized he stood before a power far greater than the enemies and the armies of the Roman Empire. Thanks be to God for Jesus Christ. Amen.